October 14, 1943, 20,000 feet above the industrial heart of Schweinfurt, Germany. The air was thin and bitter cold. Ice crystals formed on the gun barrels of the B-17 flying fortresses as they droned steadily eastward, their four Wright Cyclone engines hammering against the autumn sky. Inside the lead aircraft, 23-year-old Lieutenant James Howard from St. Louis checked his oxygen mask for the third time in as many minutes. His hands trembled. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the -40-degree temperature that turned every breath into a white plume inside his cockpit. Below, the patchwork fields of Bavaria stretched endlessly, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay the ball-bearing factories that kept the German war machine turning. And between the bombers and their target, climbing rapidly through layers of cloud, came the hunters. Major Klaus Hartmann of Jagdgeschwader 26 had been flying combat missions since the opening days of the war. 4 years, 117 confirmed kills. The Knight's Cross hung at his throat, earned over the skies of France in 1940, when the Luftwaffe ruled the air with absolute impunity. He had shot down Spitfires over Dover, Hurricanes over London, Soviet Yaks over the Eastern Front. He knew the weight of a Focke-Wulf FW-190's control stick at every speed, understood instinctively how to lead a target at 400 miles per hour, could calculate deflection angles in the fraction of a second it took to squeeze the trigger. This morning, leading a staffel of 12 aircraft, each piloted by men with similar experience, similar decorations, he climbed toward the Americans. Bombers stream with the confidence of a master craftsman, approaching familiar work. The German pilots had been briefed that the Americans would come without fighter escort. The range was too great. The P-47 Thunderbolts that occasionally appeared over the French coast couldn't reach this far into the Reich. The twin-engine P-38 Lightnings tried, but their fuel capacity fell short. And the promised P-51 Mustang, this mysterious new American fighter that intelligence reports mentioned in whispers, existed only in prototype form, or so the intelligence officers assured them. The bombers would be alone, vulnerable. The Luftwaffe would have free rein to savage them exactly as they had done 2 months earlier during the first Schweinfurt raid, when 60 flying fortresses fell burning from the sky in a single afternoon. Hartmann pushed his throttle forward, feeling the Focke-Wulf respond with eager acceleration, his wingmen tucked in close, their aircraft painted in the mottled green and gray scheme that made them nearly invisible against the autumn countryside below. The formation climbed through 8,000 meters, then 9, then 10. At 10,500 meters, they leveled off, positioned themselves ahead of the bomber stream's projected path, and waited. Through his canopy, Hartmann could see the contrails first. Dozens of white lines scratched across the deep blue vault of sky, straight as arrows, leading directly toward the heart of Germany. Then the bombers themselves became visible. Tiny, dark crosses that grew steadily larger, their wings glinting silver when they caught the sun. What none of the German pilots knew, what their intelligence had failed to discover, was that 3 weeks earlier, a seemingly minor modification had been completed at a factory in California. Long-range fuel tanks, simple cylindrical containers of pressed aluminum that could be hung beneath the wings of the P-51 Mustang, then dropped when empty. These tanks, ungainly and drag-inducing, added 300 miles to the fighter's combat radius. They transformed the Mustang from a competent short-range interceptor into something unprecedented in aviation warfare. A fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The first squadrons equipped with these modified aircraft had arrived in England only 10 days ago. The pilots were so new to combat that many had never fired their guns at an enemy aircraft. Some had logged fewer than 20 hours in the Mustang. Their average age was 22. The German aces climbing toward them that morning had more combat experience in a single month than these Americans possessed in their entire flying careers. Lieutenant Howard was one of these untrained pilots. He had earned his wings just 7 months earlier at a training field in Arizona, where the most dangerous thing he encountered was the occasional dust devil during landing practice. His total combat time amounted to exactly 4 sorties, 3 uneventful patrols over the EEQ, English Channel, and 1 brief skirmish 2 days prior in which he fired at a Focke-Wulf from extreme range and missed by what he estimated was at least 50 feet. His gunnery scores at training school had been mediocre. His aerobatic skills were adequate, but unexceptional. By every measurable standard, he was precisely what the Germans expected. An untrained amateur thrown into combat with minimal preparation, flying an untested aircraft, facing veterans who had forgotten more about aerial combat than he had yet learned. The encounter began at 09:47 hours, recorded precisely in both German and American combat logs. Hartmann spotted the American fighters first, a small group of perhaps 6 Mustangs weaving above and behind the bomber formation. He smiled inside his oxygen mask. 6 fighters to protect a formation of 300 bombers. The Americans were either foolishly optimistic or desperately short of aircraft. Either way, it made no difference. He waggled his wings, signaling his staffel to prepare for attack, then pushed his stick forward into a shallow dive that would bring them slashing through the bomber formation from ahead and above. The classic frontal attack that gave the bomber's gunners minimal time to track and fire. But something was wrong. Hartmann sensed it before he could articulate it. The American fighters didn't behave correctly. When threatened, escort fighters were supposed to remain close to their bombers, flying defensive circles above the formation. These Mustangs did the opposite. They turned directly toward the attacking German fighters, accelerating into a head-on charge that violated every tactical doctrine Hartmann had been taught. More unsettling still, they came fast, faster than any fighter he had previously encountered. The Mustang, he realized with a cold jolt of recognition, was quicker than his Focke-Wulf, substantially quicker. The distance between the two formations evaporated in seconds. Lieutenant Howard saw the German fighters as dark shapes materializing from the sun's glare. His training instructor's voice echoed in his memory. Never engage in a turning fight with a German fighter. They're more maneuverable. Use your speed, strike, and disengage. But there were bombers behind him. Bombers filled with men from Kansas and Texas and Pennsylvania. Men who had no defense against a frontal attack except their inadequate nose guns. The tactical manual said to maintain formation discipline. Howard pushed his throttle to emergency, wore power and dove straight at the leading German aircraft. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be analyzed by both German and American intelligence services for months afterward. The two formations met almost head-on, their combined closing speed exceeding 800 miles per hour. Howard's first burst was fired from 600 yards, far too distant for accurate shooting, yet 3 of his rounds struck the German leader's wing route by sheer chance, or perhaps by providence. Hartmann felt his aircraft shudder, saw fuel streaming from a punctured tank, and instinctively broke hard left to evade. His wingmen, seeing their leader break, scattered in confusion. The carefully planned formation attack dissolved into individual dogfights spread across 15 miles of sky. In the chaos, something became apparent to the German pilots, something that contradicted everything they believed about American fighter pilots. These untrained newcomers fought without the hesitation of novices. They made mistakes, yes, technical errors that any experienced pilot would notice. Their deflection shooting was often poor. Their energy management was sometimes wasteful, but they fought with an aggression that bordered on recklessness, closing to point-blank range before firing, accepting dangerous firing positions that veterans would avoid, pursuing damaged aircraft with the single-minded intensity of men who had never watched a friend die in combat, and therefore didn't understand the concept of fear-based caution. Oberleutnant Hans Krause, flying as Hartmann's wingman, found himself in a turning fight with a Mustang pilot who should have been easy prey. The American's aircraft was painted with a ridiculous cartoon character on its nose, a duck wearing a pilot's helmet. Krause noted the sloppy formation flying, the amateur's tendency to skid through turns rather than coordinate properly with the rudder. He positioned himself for the kill, settling his gun sight's illuminated cross precisely on the Mustang's cockpit. At the last moment, the American did something no rational pilot would attempt. He chopped his throttle completely and deployed full flaps at 300 miles per hour. A maneuver that risked tearing the flaps from their hinges, but which caused his aircraft to decelerate so violently that Krause flashed past him, suddenly transformed from hunter to prey. The American's guns hammered. 20-millimeter cannon shells walked up Krause's fuselage, through his cockpit, through his chest. His Focke-Wulf pitched over into a vertical dive from which it would never recover. The symbolic object that would haunt German pilots' reports afterward was ammunition, specifically the sheer quantity of it. Each Mustang carried 1,880 rounds for its machine guns and 400 rounds for its cannons, nearly double what a Focke-Wulf carried. The American pilots, with their poor marksmanship, could spray the sky with lead, compensating for their inexperience with overwhelming volume of fire. German pilots, trained to conserve every round, to fire only when certain of a hit, found themselves facing walls of tracers that turned the sky into a deadly crosshatch of burning metal. It was profligate, it was wasteful, it was terrifyingly effective. Major Hartmann managed to disengage from the initial chaos, climbed back to altitude, and assessed the situation. He had expected to find his staffel regrouping, preparing for a second coordinated attack. Instead, he found a sky full of individual combats scattered like wind-blown leaves. 3 of his aircraft were already gone. He had watched them fall, trailing smoke and fire. The Americans hadn't just defended, they had attacked with the ferocity of men who didn't understand they were supposed to lose. His radio crackled with urgent voices. "I can't shake him? Where are you 3? I'm hit! I'm hit!" The disciplined Teutonic efficiency that had characterized Luftwaffe operations for 4 years seemed to have evaporated. In the face of American chaos, the historical record shows that the engagement lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 9 German aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond the ability to return to base. The Americans lost 2 Mustangs. The bomber formation, the actual target of the German attack, proceeded to Schweinfurt virtually unmolested and dropped its payload with devastating accuracy. The ball-bearing factories burned for 3 days. German war production of crucial components fell by 40% in the following month. More significantly, something had broken in the Luftwaffe's psychological armor. For the first time since 1940, German fighter pilots had encountered an American force that didn't merely resist, but dominated. The evening of October 14, 1943, found Major Hartmann in the operations room at his base near Lille, France, dictating his after-action report to a stone-faced intelligence officer. The words came haltingly. How to explain that veteran pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience had been bested by Americans who, by all accounts, should have been easy victories? How to describe the Mustang's speed, its acceleration, its ability to dive away from any trouble and return minutes later with energy to spare? How to articulate the unsettling realization that American industrial capacity had produced not just an excellent fighter, but thousands of them, flown by an apparently endless supply of young men who cared nothing for the careful, conservation-minded tactics that German fuel shortages demanded? They fought without discipline, Hartmann said finally, searching for words that might make sense of the morning's disaster. Without proper formation integrity, without respect for tactical doctrine, he paused. But they fought without fear. Or perhaps they fought without the wisdom that fear provides. They took risks no trained pilot would accept. And their aircraft. He trailed off, remembering the Mustang that had pursued him for 5 full minutes, matching every turn, every climb, every desperate maneuver, staying on his tail like a predator locked onto wounded prey, until he had finally escaped by diving through a layer of clouds and using the terrain to break visual contact. Their aircraft is better than ours. We need to acknowledge this fact. The intelligence officer looked up from his notes, his expression carefully neutral. Better in what way? Every way that matters in combat. Faster, better range, better visibility from the cockpit. The armament is adequate, and they carry enough ammunition to spray the sky. But mostly it's the speed. When they want to engage, they engage. When they want to disengage, they disengage. We can't catch them, and we can't escape them. That's not a tactical problem. That's a technological problem. Throughout the Luftwaffe bases in occupied France, similar conversations were taking place. Pilots who had survived the day's missions gathered in their mess halls and debriefing rooms, smoking endless cigarettes, drinking coffee that tasted of acorns because real coffee was increasingly scarce, and trying to process what had happened. The Americans had been dismissed as untrained, as inferior, as pampered dilettantes who would fold when confronted with true combat. This comfortable assumption had sustained German morale through the previous year's bombing campaign. Now it lay in ruins alongside the smoking craters that marked where their comrades' aircraft had fallen. Hauptmann Werner Schroer, a pilot with 114 confirmed victories, sat in the corner of the officers' mess at Metz Frascati Airfield and wrote a letter to his younger brother, who was completing flight training at a school in Bavaria. The letter would be intercepted by American intelligence after the war, preserved in archives, and eventually published in a collection of Luftwaffe correspondence. In it, Schroer wrote, "The Americans we face today are not the Americans of last year. Something has changed. Their pilots are still inexperienced. You can see it in how they fly. But they have been given a weapon that negates our advantages. More concerning is their attitude. They come at you like men who believe victory is inevitable, who are willing to trade losses for time because they know more will come. Behind every American pilot we shoot down, there are 10 more in training. Behind every aircraft we destroy, there are 100 more on factory lines. We are killing them faster than we ever killed the British. But it doesn't matter. The mathematics are against us. They can afford to learn through casualties. We cannot." The transformation in German tactical thinking began within days. New directives arrived from Luftwaffe High Command. Avoid engagement with American fighters when possible. Concentrate on attacking bombers. Use superior altitude and speed to strike and disengage before escorts can respond. Conserve fuel. Conserve ammunition. Most tellingly, a directive that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Pilots should not hesitate to break off combat if the tactical situation becomes unfavorable. In other words, permission to retreat. Permission to survive rather than press home attacks against increasingly deadly odds. But the change wasn't merely tactical. It was philosophical. The Luftwaffe had built its identity on the mythology of the fighter ace, the lone warrior whose skill and courage could turn the tide of battle. Men like Adolf Galland, Werner Mulders, Hans Joachim Marseille had become national heroes, their kill scores published in newspapers, their photographs displayed in propaganda magazines. The ACE system worked when each individual victory mattered. When shooting down 50 enemy aircraft represented a significant dent in enemy capabilities. Against the Americans, it became meaningless. You could shoot down 5 Mustangs in a week and find 10 more in their place the following Monday. Individual excellence, the very foundation of German fighter doctrine, had been rendered strategically irrelevant by American mass production. Lieutenant Howard landed at his base in England late that afternoon, his Mustang's fuel tanks nearly empty, his ammunition boxes depleted. He had claimed 3 German fighters destroyed, though post-war analysis would confirm only 2. He was met by his squadron commander, who shook his hand and told him he'd flown well. Howard remembered thinking that the entire experience had felt less like combat and more like chaos, a confused blur of turning, firing, losing sight of the bombers he was supposed to protect, nearly colliding with a B-17 at one point, running, his engine at war emergency power until the cylinder head temperature gauge showed readings that should have been impossible. He had made at least a dozen mistakes that a better pilot wouldn't have committed. He had survived partially through luck, partially through the Mustang's performance advantages, and perhaps partially through the willingness to accept risks that a more experienced pilot would have recognized as suicidal. "Did we help?" he asked his commander. "Did the bombers get through?" They got through. Good damage to the target. 15 bombers lost, but most of those were to flak. The fighters barely touched them. Howard nodded slowly, trying to reconcile this information with his memory of the morning's chaos. It hadn't felt like success. It had felt like barely controlled disaster. But the bombers got through. That was the mission. That was the only metric that mattered. The symbolic object that came to represent American air power wasn't the Mustang itself, but rather what the Mustang represented. Abundance. The Germans flew aircraft that were, in many ways, technical marvels, beautifully engineered, meticulously maintained, capable of extraordinary performance. But each one was expensive, time-consuming to produce, difficult to replace. The Focke-Wulf 190 required approximately 10,000 man-hours to manufacture. The Messerschmitt 109 required 8,000. These aircraft were built in factories that were themselves under constant threat of bombing, supplied by industries stretched beyond capacity, fueled by synthetic petroleum that was never quite adequate to demand. German pilots learned to be conservative with their equipment because conservation was necessary. The Mustang, by contrast, required 6,000 man-hours to produce, but those hours were spread across a production system that was geographically secure. supplied by industries operating at perhaps 60% of capacity, backed by petroleum reserves so vast that American pilots trained with prodigal fuel consumption that would have appalled their German counterparts. The physical aircraft was symbolic of the broader industrial and material reality. An American pilot could take risks with his machine because another machine would be available tomorrow. A German pilot who damaged his aircraft through aggressive maneuvering might wait weeks for replacement parts that might never arrive. This abundance manifested in countless small ways that cumulatively shattered German morale. American pilots wore electrically heated flight suits that kept them warm at altitude. German pilots wrapped themselves in layers of wool and leather and still returned from missions with frostbite. American pilots ate hot meals before and after missions. German pilots subsisted on black bread and ersatz coffee. American pilots who survived being shot down and evaded capture could expect to be returned to England via underground networks, and eventually fly again. German pilots who bailed out over Allied territory vanished into POW camps for the duration of the war. Even the parachutes told the story. American pilots jumped with nylon canopies, while German pilots increasingly made do with silk alternatives as nylon became scarce. The entire material culture of the two air forces reflected divergent national realities. By November 1943, just 3 weeks after that first encounter over Schweinfurt, German Fighter Command had compiled detailed intelligence reports on the P-51 Mustang and its untrained American pilots. These reports, discovered in archives after the war, make for sobering reading. They acknowledged American technical superiority in multiple categories. They noted that American pilot quality was improving with unexpected rapidity. The steep learning curve that experience provides was being compressed by the sheer volume of combat operations. Most significantly, they predicted that within 6 months, the Luftwaffe would lose air superiority over Germany itself. This prediction, coming from an air force that had never lost air superiority over any territory it contested, represented a catastrophic admission of impending defeat. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reacted to these reports with characteristic bluster and denial. He accused his pilots of cowardice, of exaggerating American capabilities to excuse their own failures. He ordered renewed attacks on bomber formations regardless of fighter escort. He promised new aircraft with miracle capabilities that existed only on drawing boards. He demanded that pilots show the same fighting spirit that had won victories in 1940. But his orders couldn't change the mathematical reality. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots it couldn't replace, losing aircraft it couldn't reproduce quickly enough, consuming fuel it couldn't synthesize in adequate quantities. The Americans were doing the opposite on every metric. The winter of 1943-44 became a grinding war of attrition that only one side could win. American bomber formations came every day the weather permitted, protected by growing numbers of long-range fighters. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them and suffered losses that would have been unsustainable for any air force. In December, the Germans lost 567 fighters in combat. In January 1944, they lost 712. In February, 890. These weren't just aircraft. They were experienced pilots who took years to train and could never be replaced. The Americans lost aircraft too, certainly, but behind each loss stood a production system that had built 2,500 Mustangs by January and would build 9,000 more by war's end. Behind each dead American pilot stood training schools graduating hundreds, of new pilots monthly, men who were increasingly well-trained as the American system optimized its instruction based on combat experience. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who had shot down his first enemy aircraft over Poland in 1939 and who would survive the war with 33 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary entry for February 22, 1944, "We are fighting against an enemy who has solved the fundamental problem of modern war. They have married mass production to adequate quality. Their pilots are no longer exceptional, but they don't need to be exceptional. They are adequate, and there are thousands of them. Their aircraft are not superior in every metric, but they are superior in the metrics that matter for strategic bombing escort. Most devastating of all, they have time. They can learn from mistakes. They can absorb casualties. They can refine tactics through trial and error. We have none of these luxuries. Every pilot we lose is irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed comes from a production quota that's already inadequate. Every mission we fly brings us closer to culmination. This is not war as we understood it. This is industrial mathematics." The symbolic turning point came on March 4, 1944, when American fighters escorted bombers all the way to Berlin for the first time. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, the city that Göring had personally guaranteed would never be bombed, the sacred heart of Nazi power. The Mustangs flew over the Brandenburg Gate, over the Reichstag, over the Air Ministry, where Göring himself sat in impotent rage. They didn't just escort the bombers. They swept ahead of the formations, attacking German fighters on their own airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, strafing hangars and fuel trucks. The psychological impact was devastating. If Berlin could be reached by American fighters, then no location in Germany was safe. The illusion of sanctuary had been shattered. German fighter pilots who flew that day spoke afterward of a peculiar helplessness. They were outnumbered roughly 4-1. The Americans owned the altitude advantage. Engaging meant fighting at a disadvantage, but not engaging meant watching bombers pulverize the capital city. Major Gunther Roll, who would end the war as the third highest scoring ace in H. The transformation was most visible in the eyes of the young pilots who arrived at fighter squadrons that spring. In 1940, new pilots had come full of confidence, eager to join the ranks of the aces, certain of eventual victory. In 1944, they arrived already defeated in spirit. They had been trained on minimal fuel allotments, had flown obsolete aircraft during instruction, had listened to stories from veterans who spoke openly about the hopelessness of their situation. Many of these new pilots would survive less than a week in combat. Some died on their first mission, shot down by American wingmen before they could even locate the bomber formations they were supposed to attack. The average life expectancy of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot by mid-1944 was estimated at 30 operational flying hours. For comparison, a pilot needed approximately 50 hours just to become minimally competent in combat. The untrained American pilots who had first encountered the Luftwaffe in October 1943 were, by spring 1944, no longer untrained. Lieutenant Howard, who had barely survived his first major engagement, flew his 50th combat mission in April. He was now a flight leader, responsible for 3 other pilots, a combat veteran with reflexes honed by survival. The accumulated experience of hundreds of missions had turned the American fighter force into an instrument of frightening efficiency. They had learned which tactics worked. They had learned to coordinate in large formations, to assign specific roles, some aircraft to engage German fighters, others to protect the bombers directly. They had learned to use their aircraft's strengths and mask its weaknesses. Most importantly, they had learned to think systematically rather than individually. The German ACE system celebrated individual kills. The Americans celebrated mission success. This philosophical difference manifested in combat as swarms of Mustangs working together to overwhelm German formations, less concerned with who received credit for each kill than with ensuring the bombers got through. The symbolic object that haunted German pilots' reports most frequently was the drop tank, that simple aluminum cylinder that hung beneath the American fighters' wings. It was ungainly, unaerodynamic, fundamentally inelegant. German engineers would never have approved such an improvised solution. Yet that crude external tank extended the Mustang's range from 400 miles to 700 miles, and in doing so, it changed the strategic balance of the air war. When the Americans reached their combat area, they simply released these tanks and transformed back into agile fighters. The Germans, watching these tanks tumble earthward, understood what they represented. American industrial capacity was so vast that they could afford to drop precision-manufactured aluminum fuel tanks, hundreds of them, every mission, never to be recovered, and consider this acceptable wastage. Germany's entire monthly aluminum production couldn't have matched the number of drop tanks the Americans casually discarded over a single week of operations. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the air superiority battle over Western Europe. This didn't mean German fighters stopped flying or stopped fighting. They continued to resist with skill and occasionally with success. But the strategic initiative had shifted permanently. American bombers went where they wanted, when they wanted. The question was no longer whether they would reach their targets, but merely how many would be shot down en route. German fighters shifted from offensive operations to defensive missions, from seeking combat to avoiding it except under advantageous circumstances. The psychological transformation was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. General Adolf Galland, who commanded German fighter forces, wrote a lengthy report to Göring in June 1944 that represents perhaps the most candid assessment of the situation. He detailed the impossible mathematics facing the Luftwaffe. Fuel shortages limiting training to 20 hours when 100 was needed, production numbers insufficient to replace losses, pilot casualties among experienced leaders, leaving squadrons commanded by officers with minimal experience. Most significantly, he addressed the American pilot quality directly. The claim that American pilots are inferior has been proven catastrophically false. While their initial cadre may have lacked experience, they have gained it through intensive operations. More concerning is their systematic approach to air combat. They do not rely on individual excellence, but on coordinated tactics that multiply their effectiveness. They have industrialized air combat in the same way they have industrialized production. Against this approach, our ACE system is obsolete. We are producing individual craftsmen while they are producing factory workers. And in modern war, the factory workers are winning. The report was filed and apparently ignored. Göring had no solution to offer because no solution existed. The Germans could not outproduce the Americans, could not outtrain them given fuel shortages, could not develop miracle weapons quickly enough to change the strategic balance. All that remained was to fight on, to maintain the fiction that discipline and courage might somehow compensate for material inferiority, to delay the inevitable while hoping for political miracles that never came. Lieutenant Howard flew his 100th combat mission in August 1944. By then, he was a captain, commanding a squadron, responsible for training the newest replacement pilots who arrived from the States still awed by their first sight of actual combat. He briefed them carefully before their first missions. Stay in formation. Watch your fuel. Don't go chasing after damaged aircraft. Remember, we're here to protect the bombers, not to run up individual kill scores. If you do your job right, you'll never fire your guns, and the mission will still be successful. This was a radically different philosophy from the German ACE system, where individual kills were celebrated and tracked meticulously. The Americans had discovered that mission success was the only metric that mattered strategically. Individual glory was a luxury they didn't need. On September 12, 1944, Major Klaus Hartmann, the same man who had led the attack over Schweinfurt 11 months earlier, flew his last combat mission. By then, he was no longer a confident ace, but a worn survivor, flying an aircraft that leaked fuel, consuming precious gasoline that might have been better used training new pilots, leading men who were essentially sacrificial lambs sent to delay the inevitable. His formation encountered American fighters over Mannheim. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Hartmann damaged one Mustang before his own aircraft was struck by a burst that destroyed his engine and set his cockpit ablaze. He bailed out at 4,000 meters, his parachute deploying correctly, and landed in a field where local farmers watched him descend. He was alive, wounded but alive. His war was over. Of the 12 men who had flown with him that morning over Schweinfurt in October 1943, he was one of 3 still living. The others had been killed in combat, had died in accidents caused by inadequate training of replacement pilots, or had been so badly wounded they would never fly again. In his post-war interrogation by American intelligence officers, Hartmann was asked to assess what had defeated the Luftwaffe. He thought for a long time before answering. It wasn't any single factor, he said finally. Not the Mustang specifically, though that was certainly an excellent aircraft. Not American pilot quality, though they improved faster than we anticipated. It was everything together. You had enough of everything. Enough aircraft, enough pilots, enough fuel, enough time to learn from mistakes. We had enough of nothing. But most of all, it was the attitude. You came at us like men who knew victory was guaranteed if you simply kept coming. And you were correct. That's what defeated us. Not superior skill or courage, but superior certainty. You could afford to lose 100 pilots learning how to fight us effectively because you had 1,000 more behind them. We couldn't afford to lose 10. The symbolic object that survived in museums and private collections after the war was the combat film from American gun cameras. These small 16mm cameras recorded each time a pilot pressed his trigger, creating a visual record of combat. German pilots had similar cameras, but American films were different in character. They showed pilots learning in real time. Early footage featured wild spraying at extreme range, bullets going everywhere except the target. Later footage showed precise firing discipline, proper deflection shooting, textbook attacks. The films documented the learning curve, the transformation from untrained enthusiasts to professional combat pilots. German films from the same period showed the opposite trajectory. Early war footage displayed confident, precise attacks. Later, war footage showed desperate, hasty engagements by pilots trying to survive rather than win. The epilogue to this story extends beyond the war's end. The Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force by spring 1945, its remaining aircraft grounded by lack of fuel, its pilots either dead or captured or simply ordered to stop flying, to preserve lives for whatever came after. The Americans continued operations until the final day. their bomber streams passing over Germany virtually unopposed, their fighters roaming freely across what remained of the Reich. The transformation was complete. The untrained American pilots of October 1943 had become the masters of the European sky by May 1945. In the decades after the war, historians and aviation enthusiasts would debate endlessly about aircraft specifications. Which fighter was truly superior? Whether the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt 109 could match the Mustang in performance, whether German or American pilots were more skilled individually. These debates missed the essential point. The war was not won by superior machines or superior training or superior individual courage. It was won by superior systems, systems of production, systems of training, systems of logistics, systems of coordinated operation. The Americans built a machine for creating and sustaining air power, and that machine proved unstoppable once it achieved full operational tempo. The German generals who couldn't believe what American untrained pilots accomplished were victims of their own mythology. They believed excellence resided in the individual, that an experienced ace was worth 10 novices, that technical superiority in aircraft design would overcome numerical disadvantages. These beliefs were logical within the framework of warfare as they understood it. Warfare as it had existed through 1940, when quality could trump quantity, when experience provided decisive advantages. But the Americans had changed the rules. They had industrialized not just the production of weapons, but the production of warriors. They had created systems that could transform untrained civilians into adequate pilots in months rather than years, that could accept high casualty rates as the cost of learning, that could apply industrial management principles to combat operations. The bitter irony was that German engineering and German tactical doctrine were, in many respects, superior on an individual level. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a marvel of engineering. German fighter pilots' gunnery training was more thorough. German tactical manuals showed sophisticated understanding of combat dynamics. But all of this individual superiority became strategically irrelevant when confronted with a system that didn't need superiority, only adequacy at scale. An adequate pilot in an adequate aircraft, when multiplied by 1,000 and supported by unlimited fuel and ammunition, would defeat the finest ace in the finest aircraft who lacked support, lacked fuel, lacked wingmen, lacked time. This was the lesson that the German generals learned too late to matter. War in the industrial age was not about heroes, but about systems. It was not about the quality of individual warriors, but about the capacity to sustain operations over time. It was not about technical brilliance, but about adequate technology produced in overwhelming quantities. The American untrained pilots succeeded because they were components in a larger machine, a machine that learned and adapted and improved relentlessly, that absorbed losses and continued functioning, that applied resources at a scale the Germans could not match or counter. The symbolic truth that emerged from those first encounters in October 1943 was not about aviation specifically, but about two different approaches to modern warfare. The Germans believed in excellence, the excellent pilot, the excellent aircraft, the excellent tactical doctrine. The Americans believed in sufficiency, sufficient pilots, sufficient aircraft, sufficient doctrine, all multiplied by industrial capacity that could sustain operations indefinitely. In the skies over Germany, these two philosophies met in direct contest, and sufficiency at scale defeated excellence in scarcity. The untrained American pilots proved that in modern warfare, the ability to produce, train, sustain, and replace was more valuable than individual mastery. This was a hard truth, inelegant and unsatisfying to those who valued craft and skill. But it was truth nonetheless, written in the contrails above. Schweinfurt, and confirmed in every subsequent engagement. Until the war's end, the reconnaissance photographs taken of Schweinfurt after that October raid showed cratered factories, collapsed buildings, twisted machinery. But the more significant damage couldn't be photographed. It existed in the minds of German fighter pilots who now knew with absolute certainty that they were fighting an unwinnable war. It existed in the calculations of German planners who could no longer pretend that skill and courage would compensate for material inferiority. It existed in the quiet understanding that spread through the Luftwaffe that winter. An intuitive understanding never officially acknowledged, but universally recognized, that the Americans had brought a new kind of warfare to the European sky. And against this kind of warfare, there was no defense except surrender. The generals couldn't believe it. The pilots learned to accept it. And the bombers kept coming.